Soumyabrata Choudhary to kindly address the audience.
Thank you so much. This is an honor. I'm very happy to speak to you. Though this status of being a keynote speaker is not really something I deserve, so I'm just one more discussant. And that's what I'm looking forward to, discussion on something which is of course of both enormous scope and importance today, as it was earlier, and it will remain important in the future. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's ideas, thoughts, legacy, and how to revisit him in our times. So it seems to me, so I'll speak for, this program is a short one, so we should all, get equal time. So I'll speak for just about 10 to at the most 15 minutes. So it seems to me that if we want to talk about Dr. Ambedkar today, or sort of revisit him, there are two ways of thinking about this exercise. The first is that we obviously look at the specific relevance and force of his ideas in the context in which we live, and the specific unresolved and new difficulties that we confront as a society and nation. The other way of thinking about Ambedkar today would of course be to do it from the other direction, which is to first consider Ambedkar as one of the great universal thinkers with some fundamental ideas whose truth does not really get affected or get relativized by the fact that history moves along and so many new contexts and problems arise. Some fundamental values and truths don't change for that reason, and Ambedkar could be thought of as someone who is actually a great pioneering, both a thinker as well as an activist, a practitioner of such truths. So the other question then be, how do we measure up to Ambedkar's commitment to truth? Do we live a true life today? So both these questions I think are equally valid. To look at Ambedkar and his ideas, and if necessary to also modify them or adapt them to our times, but also to test our times by Ambedkar's universal, his universal ideas. So I'll try and quickly address Ambedkar from both these directions. And I'll do it through Ambedkar's own texts and some of his own key formulations. Very early on in Ambedkar's life, after he came back from America after his pioneering contribution as a sociological thinker called Castes in India, which he made from America as a student. Once he came back, he initiated a newspaper called in Marathi called Bahishkrit Bharat, which on its masthead had a very famous slogan, which we all know: educate, agitate, organize. That slogan was actually also used by other great luminaries and thinkers across the world. For instance, George Bernard Shaw used the same slogan for his Fabian newspaper, or what is called his Fabian socialist journals. Antonio Gramsci, another foundational Marxist thinker, also would use and proclaim the same slogan: educate, agitate, organize. So it seems to me that with Ambedkar, each of these three imperatives, these three commitments to educate, to agitate, to organize, remain the fundamental touchstones, the fundamental parameters by which we can actually evaluate how far has Ambedkar's own work reached us, and also how far, like I said, we measure up to Ambedkar's commitments. The first point is that this slogan needs to be actually The slogan is only half the formulation. When we say educate, agitate, organize, we are only enunciating half of the slogan. The entire slogan goes something like this. Educate, for we need all your intelligence. Agitate, for we need all your enthusiasm. Organize, for we need all your force. Which means that with education, something like the activation of a fundamental human capacity for thinking. Intelligence here does not mean intelligence in the way we think about IQ. Intelligence means a fundamental capacity to think which is universal, which cannot be discriminated in terms of, it cannot be something on the basis of which you can discriminate between human being and human being. That some think better and some whose thought is inferior. Ambedkar once said that thinking is nobody's monopoly. But that does not mean that everyone has equal access to education. So this is the first contradiction, the first discrepancy that Ambedkar addressed. That a large section of Indian society, based on caste discrimination, is prevented from the enlightenment of education, from the enablement by education. That does not mean that they do not participate in this fundamental intellectuality, the fundamental capacity to think. They think, but they are unable to activate their thinking into education. So one should not confuse education with thinking. Thinking is fundamental, thinking is egalitarian, thinking is universal. Education is something which is a privilege for some people. And in India, that is the first meaning of what is called Brahmanism, as an educational discrimination, which is not to say that only Brahmins think, or the Brahmanical elite think. So this is the first point. The second point is Ambedkar in that slogan, but also beyond that, in his entire life, spoke about intervening in society. So if there is discrimination based on caste and based on other social forms, but definitely caste is a primary question here, then what do we do about it? So one of the first things that you must take a step towards is to again activate something like the courage of people, the enthusiasm of people, which leads them to revolt, which leads them to, in a sense, break out of their individual isolation, out of their individual suffering, their individual experience of oppression, towards something like collective resistance, which is what is meant by agitation. Agitation does not necessarily mean something violent. Of course, the question of violence is very complicated. If you read Ambedkar, you will see Ambedkar again and again compares the question of minorities and what is called depressed class in those days. Then the terminology changes to scheduled caste, but actually the criminality of caste lies in untouchability in the first place, which today is a criminal word. So with Ambedkar, the point was that with untouchability, there is on the one hand extreme deprivation of dignity and the sense of worth, self-worth. On the other hand, we have to agitate based on something like the possibility or capacity for collective solidarity. Now, this is something which is not absolutely peculiar to Indian society. There are other kinds of similar discriminations, which could be based on religion, which could be based on racial discrimination. So for instance, you would refer to the Ireland question quite often. Now in Ireland, this revolt or this resistance often took violent forms. And we often say that in India, if the minorities do not resort to violent means, it does not mean there is no structural violence. There is deep violence in society. But if the low castes, the oppressed castes, do not resort to violent means and they actually adopt more petitioning means or persuasive means, then the upper caste should be grateful to the minorities. He did not say that violence does not exist. There is deep violence, structural violence. But consciously the minorities adopted non-violent means, and the upper caste should be grateful for that. Because there are other instances of similar discrimination where violence has actually also been a means of resistance. But in India, the minorities, the depressed classes have till now not adopted. So there is a deep awareness of violence, but there is also a tactical refusal to enter into the path of violent resistance. So that's the question of agitation. Now on the question of organization, this is the most difficult part, because with Ambedkar and in his entire life, to form an Ambedkarite organization was one of the most daunting tasks in his life. All his life, he tried to form different organizations based on the interests and experiences of the oppressed classes, the oppressed castes. And in doing that, he took several directions, several ways. So for instance, he took the way of trying to bring caste in relation to labor. He took the way of bringing caste in relation to something which is a kind of official representation of the interests of the erstwhile untouchable or untouchables at that time in the 1930s. So in 1935, with the government of India survey of the number of untouchable classes, he actually responded to the Government India Act survey, and he said, look, the fact that these many fragmented untouchable castes in India exist is something that is terrifying. That both that there are so many people who suffer untouchability, but also this is the nature of Indian society. It is a terrifying picture to see this fragmentation. So in that light, how does one organize? So as we know, and we don't have time to go into details, so he organized caste along the lines of the question of labor. He also organized caste along the lines of a kind of early demand towards separation, which didn't work, mostly separation of electorates, but also the earliest moves of reservation. And then, towards the last part of his life, which is the threshold of what is called the Republican Party, he, of course, famously created a Buddhist form of organization, which is apparently religious, but is actually more and different from merely religion. It is as much and probably the greatest emancipatory attempt he made, but that was at the very last stage of his life. Now, if we take all these little glimpses of the trajectory of these three fundamental projects to educate, to agitate, to organize, what happens after Ambedkar, up to now? Well, very quickly what happens is this, that on the question of education, a certain kind of institutional change starts happening with the question of reservation as a specific way of affirmative action. But the main purpose for that, as a philosophical purpose, as a value, was again to reaffirm the fundamental equality of intelligence, equality of the capacity to think in society, so that there is, in a sense, a certain kind of demolition of the idea that certain classes, certain castes intrinsically are intellectually superior, which we call Brahminism. Now the test is, and it's up to us to discuss that, has that been successful? From then to now, do certain classes in society, certain castes and certain sections in society, say intrinsically that part of society is intellectually superior to the other part of society? But that is the first part. The reservations were a fundamental question of achieving that end. How far has that worked is something to discuss. The second point about agitation is, of course, extremely important, because it took some time between 1956 and 1960s, at least 10 years hiatus, before a certain kind of autonomous Dalit movement, agitation movement, became, not from the margins, but became extremely effective in society. Very quickly we moved from between Dalit Panthers, which actually is not a political movement in a pure, statist sense. It is also a cultural, literary movement, but still, Dalit man, again inspired and in resonance with the international Black Panthers movement, anti-race movement, racist movement, leads to something far more mainstream, which is the Bahujan threshold with Kanshiram and the formation of the Bahujan Samaj Party, the BSP. This achieves, as we know, significant electoral success. For the first time, we get a sense of what we call Dalit stakes. Not just Dalit as an emblem, symbol of resistance, but also Dalit stakes in mainstream power. Or, from the other side, mainstream stakes in incorporating so-called Dalit population within representative politics, electoral politics. That has great success through specific regional centers like Uttar Pradesh, for instance. But things get complicated because there comes in the second part of the 1990s, or from the beginning of the 1990s, but moving on from then, both the event of the Mandal Commission, which in a sense is an extension of the agitational space from something which is a specific Dalit movement to what we can call the Shudra subject, the Shudra Dalit subject, which of course reminds you of Pule, the Shudra, Ati-Shudra women as a kind of configured, allied subject. But here, the question of reservation and Mandal Commission, of course, produces a different kind of a configuration and mainstream power. So the thesis is that power is something which has to be taken very seriously. Not just the question of intellectual emancipation, the value of intellectual emancipation, but power. Power is seen, it could be said, relatively agoristically. You know that power is not something to be seen morally, whether it's good or bad. Power is something which is necessary. Whether it's political power, bureaucratic power. So reservation in jobs, not just reservation in education, reservation even in the electoral space, which is of course a long project, but at this time, in a sense, it becomes an effective presence in Indian politics. But Mandal Commission immediately has a kind, and Christopher Japalot has written extremely important things about this. It has an immediate counter-revolutionary, reactionary effect, which is the Mandal moment, which actually cannot be separated from the intervention of the Mandal moment, which is its other side, which is a pushback, from this very society, which is a kind of return of a Hindu revivalist Mandal moment and its political mobilization. But the difference is the question of both the Ambedkarite force and the Mandal Commission Shudrafication force is irreversible. It cannot be reversed. Indian society has changed. So Indian politics must also change. So even Hindu revivalism must change. So to that extent, from then to now, we see intense effort to appropriate Ambedkar. To appropriate not just Ambedkar, but Ambedkarite politics, Ambedkarite force, Ambedkarite enthusiasm within Hindu mainstream. The old vertical division of society from top to bottom exists, but cannot be openly avowed anymore, cannot be openly accepted anymore. So the new kind of mobilization we are seeing today, which apparently is extremely interested in the so-called Dalit section of society, the figure of the Dalit, both in electoral politics but also ideological politics. So this is the picture, it seems to be. So now to end the last 2-3 minutes, how do we think about ourselves in the light of this historical moment, but going back to Ambedkar's own commitment to a kind of universal emancipatory values? Ambedkar himself once said that we have to differentiate, whether in politics or in social thought, between responsible thinking and habitual thinking. Habitual thinking is to think through a kind of repetition. We repeat, even of great thinkers, including Ambedkar today, we repeat him. And by repeating him, we in a sense pay our debt to him, but we also partly freeze him, lock him. The other kind of thinking Ambedkar says is to think responsibly, which means what? Take responsibility for your own thinking. Your thinking could be bad, your thinking could be damaging, but at least take responsibility for it. It seems to be one of the big problems today is that whichever side you're thinking from, extreme left, to kind of Congressist center position, to extreme right, Hindu right, no one is willing to take responsibility for the thinking. Everyone wants to put it on the heads of what they call the great thinkers from the past. So name after name, people who are not there. Savarkar is not here, Gandhi is not here, Ambedkar is not here, the mortal man. But everyone speaks in the names of others. And everyone is trying to appropriate everyone else, mostly. On the left, of course, there's a question of a different kind of a lineage of thinking. But even the great left lineage is from the past, mostly. So this is something which makes us habitual thinkers and not responsible thinkers. In the sense we are not taking responsibility for our own ideas, however good or bad they may be. So that's why when our ideas actually lead to very bad results, and not just in India, this is happening all over the world. What's happening in Israel is also a result of Zionist thinking. But no one wants to take responsibility for the thought. So someone in Israel will say, oh, this is not us, this is the history, this is the way it has been always. No one says, we take responsibility in this moment. Here, we are not willing to take responsibility. We will say, oh, this is what Ambedkar had said. Oh, anti-minorities sentiment is something which we didn't invent. It's something which already, someone you yourself respect, it was there in Ambedkar, which is a total falsification, total distraction. But we are not willing to go into the labor of thinking. We want it already to be ready-made, which is also the kind of package commodification of market society. So this seems to me to be a major difficulty about revisiting Ambedkar. So we have to revisit ourselves in the light of Ambedkar. That seems to be more important than merely revisiting Ambedkar. That is our work. That is the discussion that I think we should have. Let's revisit ourselves today in the light of the truth of Ambedkar. What does it mean to say truth of Ambedkar? The truth is this. I saw a film last night, coincidentally, before I talked to you today. It was Julian Assange, the whistleblower, who is in a prison in Belmarsh, who, if he goes to America, will be given 150 years jail term. And the film said that what is it that Julian Assange was fighting for? The truth. But what does it mean to say truth? The truth is that which is denied to some people. So the slave is denied truth. But if the slave had truth, what would the slave say? The slave would say, slavery is not true. Slavery is a lie. And so the slave would say, I am not a slave. What would the untouchable, the word untouchable is criminal today, nevertheless, the untouchable say, the untouchable would say, untouchability is a lie, it is not the truth. And hence the untouchable would say, I am not untouchable. What would the oppressed in general say? Oppression is a lie, which means I'm not inferior, and I refuse oppression. So that's why the universal is also always the fight for truth of those very ones who are denied the truth here and now. I think we have to revisit ourselves by that measure. Thank you for your attention.